Off the coast of Northern Ireland, on a spit of land battered by Atlantic wind, a stone-lined grave sat sealed for nearly 4,000 years. Rathlin Island. The burial dates to roughly 1934 BC. A single man laid in a cyst of fitted stone, undisturbed until modern archaeology reached him. What made him remarkable wasn't the grave itself, but what was locked inside his cells. His Y-chromosome carried a lineage designation, R1bL21, and that same lineage remains the single most common male genetic marker in Ireland today. In 2016, geneticists took his genome and ran it against every population they could reach, searching for his closest living and ancestral relatives. The answer didn't point toward Gaul. It didn't point toward Britain. It didn't even point toward anywhere near Ireland. It pointed nearly 4,000 kilometers east, to the open grasslands stretched between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. How does a Bronze Age Irishman's closest genetic relative end up herding cattle in Ukraine 1,000 years before he was even born? That question has haunted the search for a Celtic homeland, a search that has occupied historians and linguists for 2 full centuries. And it dead ends in a place none of them were looking. Stick around, because genetics is about to rewire half of what we thought we knew about who the Celts even were, and it is worth the whole ride. The island grave was just the first data point. The full picture starts 1,000 years earlier, and a continent away. Start with what most people already believe. Celtic DNA conjures redheads, a homeland stretched across Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. A single ancient tribe pressed to the Atlantic fringe by the advance of Rome. That picture collapsed under its own dataset. In 2015, Leslie and colleagues published in Nature the largest fine-scale genetic study of its kind, drawing on 2,039 UK genomes. The direct finding: no evidence exists for a unified Celtic genetic population anywhere in non-Saxon Britain. Cornwall, the textbook image of Celtic identity, turned out genetically closer to English Devon than to Wales. The single deepest split in the entire British dataset wasn't Celt versus Saxon at all. It was Orkney against everyone else, a signature left by Norse settlement. Even Wales fractured internally, splitting into northern and southern clusters more genetically distinct from each other than either was from parts of England. The word Celtic had been doing far more linguistic and cultural work than genetic work. If there is no single Celtic genome anywhere in Britain, the question flips entirely. What genome does keep showing up, again and again, in every place where Celtic languages were once spoken? That recurring signature traces back to one Bronze Age population, the Yamnaya. Their homeland was the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the open grasslands spanning modern Ukraine and southern Russia, flourishing between roughly 3,300 and 2,600 BC. The name itself comes from the Russian word yama, meaning pit, a reference to their pit grave burials, sunk beneath earthen kurgan mounds that still dot the steppe landscape. Genetically, the Yamnaya formed from a blend of Eastern hunter-gatherer and Caucasus hunter-gatherer ancestry, fused together on that grassland frontier. They were pastoralists at their core, moving cattle, sheep, and horses across vast open territory, and they stand among the first populations to actually ride those horses rather than simply hunt and eat them. Archaeologists trace their cultural cradle to Mikhailivka, in southern Ukraine, a site that anchors the origin of the wider Yamnaya expansion. What set them apart wasn't just the animals, it was the machinery of movement. Ox-drawn wagons gave Yamnaya pastoralists a mobility engine unlike anything nearby populations possessed, letting a single rider or herder cover 5 to 10 times the ground that someone on foot ever could. That kind of range meant grazing territory could expand continuously, generation after generation, without the population ever needing to settle permanently in one place. That mobility is exactly what turned a steppe cattle herding culture into the genetic ancestor of people who would never once lay eyes on a steppe. The scene shifts west. Around 3000 BC, groups descended from the Yamnaya begin moving into Europe, carrying that steppe ancestry with them. In 2015, Haak and a team of roughly 90 co-authors published in Nature an analysis of 69 Bronze Age genomes, confirming steppe ancestry as a primary source underlying Indo-European-speaking populations across the continent. What this meant for Europe's existing Neolithic farmers, the people who had built the megaliths and established the first wheat and cattle economies, was not simple continuity. Ancient DNA reveals a strong male-biased replacement pattern across multiple regions, a demographic signature rather than a cultural rumor. A 2025 Harvard-led study, led by Lazaridis, drawing on 450 ancient genomes, names this event the steppe pulse, tracing it from Hungary in the west all the way to western China in the east. Geneticist Iosif Lazaridis put it directly. The Yamnaya sit at the root of all populations that speak Indo-European languages today. Not a myth about invaders. A measurable, datable, genome-wide fact. The steppe ancestry never arrived in Western Europe labeled Yamnaya. It moved through an intermediary, the Bell Beaker culture, named for its distinctive bell-shaped drinking cup, spreading across Western and Central Europe between roughly 2750 and 2200 BC. In 2018, Olalde and colleagues published in Nature an analysis of 400 genomes, 226 of them Beaker-associated individuals. The central finding was stark. In Britain specifically, the Beaker expansion is linked to the replacement of roughly 90% of the existing gene pool. Yet the same study uncovered something that complicated a tidy single migration story. Limited genetic connection between the Beaker populations of Iberia and the Beaker populations of Central Europe, ruling out one unified migratory wave as the explanation for the whole phenomenon. The Bell Beaker package itself, the pottery, the archery gear, the copper daggers, spread partly as culture and partly as people, and the two did not always travel together. Britain absorbed nearly its entire population turnover through this single channel. Iberia's story runs on a completely different clock. 271 ancient Iberians. That's the sample size behind Olalde and colleagues' 2019 study in Science. The highest resolution genetic transect of the Iberian Peninsula ever assembled. The numbers it produced are stark. By roughly 2000 BC, 40% of Iberia's overall ancestry had shifted to steppe-descended lineages, and on the male line the change was almost absolute. Nearly 100% of Y-chromosomes across the peninsula had been replaced. Lead researcher Carls Laweza-Fox described the prior Y-chromosome lineages of Copper Age Iberia as almost entirely replaced by a single lineage, R1b M269, over a window of roughly 400 years. That is a near-total male genetic turnover compressed into a handful of centuries. And yet co-author Inigo Olalde is explicit about what the data does not show. There is no evidence of violence accompanying this shift. He states plainly that it would be wrong to claim the local population was displaced. So the disconnect sits right there in the same dataset. A near-complete replacement of male lineages, paired with no detectable warfare signature anywhere in the remains studied. Total genetic replacement and a total absence of violence evidence, side by side, and the mechanism behind that pairing still is not settled. That leaves one open question hanging over the whole peninsula, and the Basques answer it in a way nobody expected. The Basque language stands apart from every other tongue in Europe. It is a linguistic isolate, not Indo-European, unrelated to Celtic, unrelated to anything else on the continent. If ancestry tracked language the way many assume it should, Basques ought to look genetically distinct from their Celtic-speaking neighbors. Olalde's 2019 findings say otherwise. Present-day Basques are best described as a typical Iron Age population, carrying essentially the same steppe-descended ancestry found across the rest of Iron Age Iberia. Rodriguez Luis and colleagues, in 2021, examined Basque Y-chromosome data directly and found a Bronze Age dispersal of RS116 lineages, reaching the Basque country and replacing the region's earlier Paleolithic and Neolithic Y-chromosomes. The same pattern documented everywhere else on the peninsula. The long-standing idea of the Basques as an unbroken Paleolithic genetic isolate simply does not hold up against the Y-DNA evidence. In this one case, language and ancestry are almost completely decoupled from one another, so the steppe signal does not track Celtic language at all. The actual Celtic identity has to be built somewhere else entirely. Back to Ireland, and to the paper that started this whole thread. Cassidy and colleagues published in PNAS in 2016, comparing two Irish burials separated by roughly 1,300 years. The Ballynahody woman, dated to somewhere between 3343 and 3020 BC, carried predominantly Near Eastern farmer ancestry. Black hair, brown eyes, a genetic profile closer to a Southern European Neolithic farmer than to anything resembling a typical modern Irish person. The Rathlin Island men, dated between 2026 and 1534 BC, tell a completely different story. Substantial Pontic steppe ancestry, blue eye alleles, the hemochromatosis variant that remains common in Ireland today. And Y haplogroup R1b, still the most frequent male lineage in Ireland right now. Co-author Eileen Murphy of Queen's University Belfast called the project one that answered questions that had long perplexed academics about Irish origins. The turnover documented here happened within the compressed window of the Bronze Age itself, not as some gradual drift stretched across millennia. Move east across the Irish Sea and up into the Alps, and the same steppe signal shows up wearing an entirely different set of clothes. If any single place has earned the title Celtic Heartland, it is Hallstatt, Austria, the site that gave an entire Iron Age culture its name. The Hallstatt period runs roughly from 800 to 450 BC, defined by ironworking, salt mining, and elaborate burial practice. Above the town sits the salt mine cemetery, where more than 1,000 graves have been excavated since the 1840s, spanning roughly 800 to 400 BC. What makes the site remarkable is how salt income and grave goods spread across multiple social tiers rather than pooling only among an elite few. Modest iron knives sit alongside elaborate bronze belt sets and imported Mediterranean vessels, distributed across the community. Salt's preservative properties left behind an exceptional organic record rarely found anywhere else in Iron Age Europe. Leather backpacks, wooden staircases, one of them dated to 1344 BC, the oldest known staircase in Europe. Woolen sacks, still intact after millennia underground. This is the site that lends its name to the entire Hallstatt culture, the first archaeologically defined Celtic horizon in the historical record. The graves preserved the objects. It took ancient DNA, arriving in 2024, to tell us who was actually buried in the richest of them. Gretzinger and colleagues published in Nature Human Behavior in 2024, running a genomic analysis of 31 Iron Age individuals, drawn from southern Germany's early Celtic elite. The central finding reshapes how succession is understood among these communities. An avuncular relationship, a biological uncle and his nephew, found buried in two of the richest Hallstatt culture burial mounds. That pattern points toward a matrilineal system of dynastic succession operating among early Celtic elites, rather than the father-to-son model usually assumed. The network of related elites extends across a broad geographic territory, even though no direct parent-child link connects the two richest tombs studied. Two other elite Hallstatt period burial sites round out the comparison. Hochdorf, a chieftain burial furnished with an elaborate bronze funerary couch, and Vix, a richly furnished female elite tomb, both cited as part of this same broader elite pattern across the culture. This reframes Celtic aristocracy entirely, moving it away from a simple father-to-son model and towards something closer to a dispersed network anchored matrilineally. The genetic data suggests power passed through uncles and nephews, not fathers and sons, the reverse of the dynastic model usually assumed for Iron Age Europe. Germany's elite graves rewrote succession. France's ordinary graves rewrote the migration map instead. A 2025 preprint titled Tracing the Spread of Celtic Languages Using Ancient Genomics brought new genomic data spanning the Bronze and Iron Ages of Europe, and it identified a demographic engine nobody had previously named at this scale. The Novi's subgroup of the Urnfield culture, formed in the Carpathian Basin roughly 4,000 to 3,200 years before present, turns out to be a major driver of population movement across the continent. That Novi's-related ancestry expanded across much of Western Europe between 3,200 and 2,800 years before present, reaching territories far beyond its Carpathian origin point. On the European mainland, something unexpected shows up in the data. Bell Beaker-derived ancestry is often low or entirely absent. Instead, the steppe signal on the continent traces through this separate Bronze Age route, moving out of the Novi's and Hungary-Serbia region rather than through the Beaker Channel documented in Britain. In France specifically, Iron Age populations can only be accurately genetically modeled by including a Bronze Age source from Eastern Central Europe, the same eastward origin pattern that shows up independently in the British data. Even Hallstatt itself, the burial ground that gave the entire culture its archaeological name, shows internal diversity once the genomes are examined individually. Within that same cemetery, some individuals are modeled with Cnovies-related ancestry, while others carry Hungarian or Serbian Bronze Age-related ancestry instead. Two distinct genetic profiles, buried in the same ground, under the same cultural banner. So even the culture that gave Celtic its archaeological name wasn't one genetic population. It was at least two, buried side by side. The scale of the next dataset changes the entire resolution of this story. Patterson, Isakov, Booth, and colleagues published in Nature in 2022, the largest ancient DNA dataset ever assembled for Britain, adding 793 new genomes and producing a 12-fold increase in coverage for the Middle to Late Bronze Age and the Iron Age. What that density revealed was a second, entirely distinct migration wave into southern Britain, concentrated between 1000 and 875 BC. These migrants are genetically most similar to ancient individuals from France, and they go on to contribute roughly half the ancestry found in Iron Age England and Wales. This movement is separate from, and centuries later than, the original steppe-driven turnover tied to the Beaker expansion. Northern Britain tells a different story entirely. Scotland does not show the same increase in this later period, meaning the wave landed unevenly across the island rather than sweeping it uniformly. Nature commentator Daniel Bradley, writing in 2022, described this as the discovery of unprecedented granularity in Britain's migratory past, a level of resolution the earlier, sparser datasets simply could not reach. Two separate steppe-descended waves, centuries apart, both aimed at the same island. Only one of them is the one usually credited with bringing Celtic speech. There is a second, independent way to track all of this, running parallel to the autosomal ancestry percentages already laid out. The Y-chromosome data offers its own trail. RP312 stands as the parent lineage tightly linked, spatiotemporally, to Bell Beaker associated ancestry, and its subclades sort geographically with striking precision. R1B-L21 dominates in Britain and Ireland. R1B-DF27 dominates in Iberia instead, and García-Fernández and colleagues documented its rapid Bronze Age expansion there specifically, in a 2022 study focused on that peninsula alone. Same root steppe lineage, splitting into regionally distinct branches as it fanned outward from its original Bell Beaker point of dispersal. This approach lets researchers trace something more specific than the broad claim that steppe ancestry simply arrived somewhere. It lets them trace which particular sublineage arrived in which particular place, and roughly when. Put plainly, the Y-chromosome map alone can trace the fault lines between Ireland, Britain, and Iberia without a single autosomal statistic standing behind it. Line up every regional case examined so far. Britain shows roughly 90% turnover through the Beaker expansion, followed by a second, French-linked wave arriving centuries later. Ireland shows Rathlin's steppe-heavy Bronze Age men, carrying the lineage still dominant on the island today. Iberia shows 40% ancestry replacement alongside near-total Y-chromosome replacement. Central Europe shows Canovis-descended Urnfield ancestry spreading between 3,200 and 2,800 years before present. Every one of these regional populations, each one labeled Celtic in some form, traces its dominant male lineage back to the same Pontic-Caspian steppe source population. None of them trace directly to each other. None of them trace to a single migrating Celtic tribe moving as one body across the map. The word Celtic describes a language family and a set of archaeological styles, Latène art, Hallstatt burial customs, adopted across genetically distinct regional populations that never shared a single point of origin as a people. What connects them isn't a Celtic ancestor at all. It's a shared, much older steppe ancestor, filtered through separate regional migrations that landed centuries or even millennia apart from one another. One ancestor, at least 4 separate arrivals. 0 unified Celtic genome, and that is the part that should reset how the whole subject gets taught. So why does the steppe match keep winning against every other candidate researchers have tested? Line the alternatives up directly. Egyptian and Near Eastern farmer ancestry, the same profile carried by the Bali-Nahadi woman, sits in the deep background of every European population. But by the Bronze Age, it had grown too diluted and too non-specific to explain any regional pattern on its own. Mediterranean and Etruscan-linked ancestry shows up in trade contact and imported goods at sites like Hallstatt, but never surfaces in the dominant Y-chromosome signal of any of these populations. Local Mesolithic hunter-gatherer ancestry persists as a minority component almost everywhere, strongest in parts of Wales, but it never becomes the dominant signal anywhere after the Bronze Age arrives. Set against all of these, Yamnaya descended ancestry is the one component that shows up as the dominant, recurring signal in every single named Celtic region tested. Ireland, Britain, Iberia, and Central Europe alike, each one landing on the same steppe source despite arriving there through entirely separate migrations. It isn't the most romantic candidate in the running. It is simply the one the data keeps landing on, no matter which region gets tested next. Every rival theory gets ruled out region by region. The steppe candidate is the only one that survives every single test. A single Pontic-Caspian pastoralist population managed to out-reproduce and out-expand established European farming societies in less than a millennium, and the mechanism behind that expansion breaks down into a handful of concrete advantages. The horse comes first. This population sits among the earliest to actually ride rather than simply herd, and that shift multiplied travel range 5 to 10-fold over walking alone. The wagon follows close behind, ox-drawn transport that enabled sustained long-distance contact and exchange networks rather than a single one-way migration event. Diet mattered too. A high-protein, dairy-heavy pastoral diet tied directly to the spread of lactase persistence, a trait that, according to the lactase timing data in the Patterson 2022 study, rose in frequency in Britain, notably earlier than it did on the continent. Advanced metalworking and weapon technology traveled alongside the migrating groups, giving them a further material edge over the populations they encountered. And running underneath all of it is a demographic pattern documented across multiple regions, a male bias signature, with Y-chromosome turnover consistently outpacing the broader autosomal ancestry turnover, region after region, dataset after dataset. Mobility, protein, and metal explain the spread. They do not explain why, in Iberia at least, it happened with no detectable violence at all. Set the two extremes side by side. On one hand, near-total male lineage replacement, Iberia showing roughly 100% of its Y chromosomes turned over, Britain showing roughly 90% of its entire gene pool replaced through the Beaker expansion. On the other hand, a functionally undetectable conflict signature in the skeletal record from those same transitional periods. Reich and Olalde's own caution in the science paper stands as the clearest statement of this tension. It would be wrong to state that the local population was displaced, given the complete lack of violence evidence in the remains examined. The literature offers alternate, non-violent mechanisms to explain the gap, a disease differential that thinned existing populations before incoming groups arrived, a marriage pattern imbalance that favored incoming males over local men, economic or status advantages tied directly to pastoralist mobility and access to metal goods, advantages that could shift reproductive outcomes without a single act of violence. No single one of these mechanisms has been confirmed by ancient DNA alone. The genetic data can measure the replacement with real precision. It cannot yet explain the social process that produced it. Not proof of conquest, proof of turnover, with the cause still unresolved. Return to Leslie and colleagues' 2015 finding, now with the steppe context filled in behind it. No single Celtic genetic cluster exists anywhere in non-Saxon Britain, and the reason for that absence is now visible in full. Multiple separate steppe-descended migration waves arrived at different times, into different regions, from different immediate source populations. The Beaker-era wave on one hand, the later France-linked wave on the other. Wales's genetic clusters are described as more similar to Britain's earliest post-Ice Age settlers than to other UK regions, meaning Wales actually preserves more pre-steppe ancestry than most people assume for a place treated as purely Celtic. Cornwall's closer genetic resemblance to Devon rather than to Wales further undercuts any notion of a shared Celtic gene pool stretching across the Atlantic fringe. The linguistic label survived even as the actual genetic record split apart into regional fragments that never matched each other. Language held together what genetics never did, and that gap is the real story hiding under the word Celtic. Bring the full timeline together, start to finish. Yamnaya established on the Pontic-Caspian steppe by 3300 BC. Bell Beaker mediated arrival in Western Europe beginning roughly 2750 BC, replacing close to 90% of Britain's gene pool. A parallel, separate steppe-descended replacement unfolding in Iberia by 2000 BC. 40% ancestry turnover alongside near-total Y-DNA replacement. A Canovies and Urnfield-linked expansion spreading across the mainland between 3200 and 2800 years before present. A second, France-linked wave arriving in Britain between 1000 and 875 BC. And finally, Hallstatt's elite culture crystallizing by 800 BC, carrying its own matrilineal succession pattern. Every one of those stages is separately dated, separately sourced, and separately confirmed by named ancient DNA studies standing on their own evidence. What ties them together isn't a Celtic migration at all. It is one much older steppe population, arriving in waves centuries apart, absorbed into distinct regional identities that only later got grouped together under a single linguistic label. The match at the center of this whole story isn't a rival ancient civilization in the sense of Egypt or Rome. It's a population most people have never heard named at all. The Celts, as a single genetic people, never existed. What existed was one steppe population's descendants, showing up again and again, in places that never knew about each other. If ancestry keeps tracing back to one Bronze Age steppe population regardless of region, what does Celtic identity actually describe once the genetics are subtracted from it entirely? Every named study across this record agrees on the ancestry component. None of them agree yet on why the replacement unfolded the way it did in each individual region. Several threads remain open in the literature. The exact social mechanism behind Iberia's near-total, apparently non-violent Y-chromosome turnover still has no confirmed explanation. How language spread in cases where genetics and speech clearly decoupled, as with the Basques, remains an active question. And whether further sampling in southeastern and alpine Europe will reveal even more separate steppe-descended waves, not yet dated or documented, is still entirely open. If genetics and language really did travel separately for 2,000 years, how much of what we call Celtic culture was ever really about ancestry at all, and how much was always about who told the story afterward? The DNA has an answer. What it means is still being written.